Okay, good. All right, so this is the March 10th Planning Commission meeting, and can we have the roll?
Commissioner LaSalle.
Present.
Commissioner Schlagenhofer.
Here.
Commissioner Stoll.
Here.
Commissioner Meinig.
Here.
Commissioner Laws.
Here.
Vice Chair Dole.
Here.
Chair Espy.
Here. Okay, so next item on the agenda, we will have the approval of the minutes from 2/24. Does anybody have any additions, subtractions, concerns, questions about the minutes? Can we hear a motion for the minutes?
I'll move to approve the February 24th, 2025 Planning Commission minutes.
Great.
I second.
Okay, moved by Commissioner LaSalle and seconded by Carla Laws. And so for the next item, we have
We need to take a vote.
vote for the minutes, right? Thank you.
Commissioner LaSalle.
Aye.
Commissioner Schlagenhofer.
Yes.
Commissioner Stoll.
Aye.
Commissioner Meinig.
Here.
Commissioner
Yes.
Laws.
Aye.
Vice Chair Dole.
Aye.
Chair Espy.
Aye. All right, so now we can go to the next meeting, the next item. And we have, this evening, we have the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Conceptual Report. And I will hand it over to Aquila for the report, for
Sounds
the
good.
presentation.
Thank you. So our consultant, Brian, is here tonight, and he's going to give a presentation that kind of wraps up our what we heard from the public during our public outreach.
Excellent.
I'm sorry. Hi, everybody. Brian Davis, Studio Davis, 1125 Southwest Morrison Street, Portland. I don't know if I needed to do that or not. So I wanted to kind of circle back with you guys. We, of course, talked in February actually all the way back in January 13th, I think, at a little bit of a higher level about CFEC and what the city needs to do to come into compliance with the new Oregon administrative rules regarding parking requirements and design considerations. That was at the beginning of our outreach process, and you can advance to the next slide, please. Actually, just skip that one. I meant to take that one out, actually, because we talked about that last time. But essentially, the new rules exist to, the high-minded goal is to reduce the construction of underutilized, overabundant parking, the parking that just sits empty all the time, and for the parking that does get constructed to make that a little bit prettier and more climate friendly in terms of landscaping requirements and electric vehicle requirements and those sorts of things. So we've been for the past couple months now doing our outreach process, taking our kind of analysis at a high level of, what needs to happen prescriptively, where there are some choices, where Oregon City has latitude to kind of shape things the way you want to the various commissions around the city, as well as a public event back in February, and got, I think, some pretty good direction from all of these on some of the open-ended questions here. So we're kind of wrapping up that outreach phase now with one last presentation to you, as well as a presentation to the City Commission work session tomorrow evening. And then the next time I see you is going to be probably, I think, April 14th tentatively, at which point we will be asking for the formal action of the Planning Commission to either approve or disapprove of our recommendations, approve with qualifications, et cetera, and make a recommendation to City Council accordingly to make sure you guys come into compliance by the June 30th deadline. So next slide, please. Kind of 2 bullet points for what I want to do tonight. Just kind of, again, close the loop on the feedback process, tell you basically the things that we've been hearing, at least the general kind of direction we've been given from you, from the other commissions, and from the citizens, and how that is shaping, or how those recommendations are shaping our recommended code requirements, which we're in the process of doing and in consult with your city staff there. But we have some recommendations at this point and some level of specificity to share. And then there are also a number of questions that were raised January 13th that we weren't able to answer with firmness that evening. So I did go back and talk to the folks at the DLCD, Ryan Markart and Evan Manville, mostly on that. And we have some answers on that, which I think is going to be our next slide. Yeah, so three things that, that you brought up that I said we would look into and get back to you. There was a question about, so there's an administrative rule that requires you fairly loosely to permit some underutilized parking to be redeveloped into things like, you know, street seats, outdoor seating for restaurants, and those sorts of things. There was a question about whether there could be a parking study to require that, and DLCD said no, that would qualify as a parking requirement under the definition, which is provided there. I did miss a 0 in front of the 5, I apologize for that, but that's where the definition of parking requirement comes in. And yeah, a parking study in the area where they are exempt from having minimums would not be allowed under the new rules. However, you could continue to have a parking study or whatever you wanted to in an area where the parking minimums remained. Second question, I wanted to circle back on regards the frequency of line 33. There was a question about, you know, if that were reduced to once every 20 minutes, every 25 minutes, and we're no longer, you know, met TriMet's definition of frequent transit, would we still be required to eliminate parking minimums within that area? And the answer to that is also yes, you would have to eliminate parking minimums, even if you reduce the frequency. The way they wrote that actually it does feel like they anticipate that exact sort of thing. Like, well, what if we reduce the frequency? It's basically the line that is the most frequent transit line in your city. So really, there's no way to get around the requirement to waive minimums within that area. And lastly, can you have a requirement for an EV charging station adjacent to an asphalt area with new residential development? Again, sound like a broken record here. Again, kind of the messenger / code interpreter here, not the decider, but again, the answer to that is no. The asphalt area would pretty clearly qualify as a parking space per their definition of parking space, which again, I said it there, but did miss a 0. You know, it's interesting, that got me thinking though, what if you required the EV charging station without the asphalt? Could you do that? And that's interesting. That may in fact be a yes. I'm not sure if DLCD would like it, and I'm sure they would have a comment on it, but it feels like that would be a yes. But I do want to kind of talk about that for a second, because the whole universe of what we're trying to figure out here, you know, at the state level and make policy on that as well as we can, as well as they can at the state level, is how do you incentivize the right sizing of parking, which means how do you incentivize a developer building what people are going to use, what people are going to need for the business to be successful, for the residents to sell or to rent, and to be the happy and successful home of a prosperous family. And that essentially is what the whole point of this is trying to figure out what that number is. The requirements that have typically been parking minimums pretty clearly haven't been good answers for that. So, you know, raises the question, what's a better answer? And so it's interesting because maybe putting an EV stall there or an EV charging station and not having the requirement for a parking space because you can't might incentivize the building of parking spaces, but that sort of raises kind of the follow-up question. How much more would that incentivize it versus the incentive that's already there to build the parking space to, you know, to sell the home for a higher value, to support the, to support the business with that infrastructure. And the more I think about that, the more I think it's just, you know, you're acquiring a piece of infrastructure that costs, let's say conservatively, $10,000, $20,000 for an off-street parking space. By having an EV charging station, which would be a $2,000 or $3,000 piece of infrastructure, it just feels like the more powerful kind of motivator to build that parking space to support the residential development would be the residence itself and those, those sorts of invisible hand economic things that people are going to need parking spaces in the context of Oregon City and their residents. I think even after we have these minimums there, those are going to be the development patterns that you see. I'm curious if the city has gotten anything in the exempt area so far under the new requirements that you're already required to not enforce the parking requirements, right?
Correct. So you're asking if we've already reviewed and approved development?
Yeah, if there's been any development, if there's been any residential development and what they're, now in this era of no requirements, what they're proposing parking wise.
I have to think about it.
Not to put you guys on the spot, I was just sort of wondering about that when I was thinking about that, which I think is an interesting question about, a backdoor EV requirement without the parking requirement.
I think we have a development coming up that's on 7th and maybe it's JQ Adams that we won't be able to require parking there. But I think some of the other middle housing type things that you've seen came in for land use prior to that rule going into effect, although they were built after it was in effect.
Gotcha. Thanks. I was just kind of curious about that, thinking about that. But does that all make sense? I forgot which of you had those questions, but is that, I'm not going to ask you if it's a satisfying answer. Is it an answer that makes sense to you? Do you have follow-up questions or anything?
It's an accurate answer, and that's really all that matters.
That's, yeah, okay. Do you regard it as accurate? Please.
Can I ask a little more clarity on I'm looking for the definition of parking space. I haven't quite found it yet. I was hoping to find it before we moved on. Is it the space? Is it the ground cover? I mean, is it the asphalt and concrete? Is it the reserved space? What defines the parking space?
The definition 660-012- and again, I'm
32.
missing a 0, but it's 0005.
It's 0005.
And
Okay.
those are the definitions, is number 32.
All right. That showed up as public plaza.
Yeah, it says parking spaces means on and off-street parking spaces designated for automobile parking other than parking spaces reserved for automobiles for sale or rent, fleet vehicles, carpools or van pools, or parking under the ADA.
So it doesn't include carpool or van pool?
It does not. In the definition of parking spaces, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, it seems like then they want you to calculate that outside of
Was the definition of parking space under 32?
32 is the actual parking spaces itself. So
Under
if you go to the
005.
definitions in 660, 012, 0005, there's, that's the definition section, and so
Yeah,
parking spaces just happens to be number 32.
but is parking spaces under 32?
Parking spaces is 32.
I'm looking at the wrong one. Where did you find it?
Let me pass this down.
Oh, that'll be faster. Okay. You you can go on. I'm just going to study this while we keep.
Okay, we could always
Thank
go
you.
back to it. Next slide, please. So, yeah, so the next several slides here, thanks so much to Aquila for putting the basis of this together. But we identified several specific requirements that we thought were pretty ripe to get some public input and shape our recommendations based on that. So I'm just gonna kind of walk you through those administrative rules, what we heard, and how that's manifested in the recommendation in the conceptual report. This is not going to be an exhaustive list of the code changes that are needed or recommended to come into compliance. These are just kind of the highlights. What's given in the conceptual report that's in your packet is exhaustive and has a pretty complete set of, again, not formal code language yet. We're still in the process of developing it, but an exhaustive list of the bullet pointed things that we're going to need to do to the code requirements to meet the new rules. So this is one we already touched on a little bit, the idea that underused on-street parking, on and off-street parking may be redeveloped for other purposes. There was a lot of support for this idea, and there was a lot of support for the idea of shared parking. We did think we would need a definition of underused, even though the way the rules are written, it sort of lets each property owner decide what is or isn't underused on their own. We did want to have some guidance in the code to, give them some idea of how to make sense of that. We have code language there and that definition added. I also should say as well, part of it, especially when we start talking about on-street spaces and things that you're going to need to do there are not actually code requirements, at least in the development code that we're recommending, that are needed to come into compliance with that. There are a few things that we've detailed in the conceptual report that will likely need to be addressed by your next TSP update. Particularly when we're talking about changes to the on-street parking, things you're going to need to do there, like provide bike parking in key destinations and things like that. Next slide, please.
Okay. I found something on that.
Yeah, you want
So,
to circle back?
The way I see it, the language pretty much describes improved parking spaces. I don't feel like it would prevent us from having them set aside space for a parking space with a charger in the future. But once you don't set that land aside, then the chargers become impossible later. So I still feel like we could possibly set aside land, not improve it, because the language is for an improved space.
Then we end up with conflicts with our own code, which requires improved spaces. We have specific language around surfacing, surfaces.
Well, okay, an example, the apartments that are going up on Beaver Creek, there is reserved space in the right-of-way for the roadway to get wider. It's reserved, but there's no roadway currently there, it's grass. But we've reserved it so we can put in 5 lanes at some point. But once you build a building next to a 3-lane road, you can no longer expand. So if we set aside the land now, we're already setting land aside for other uses like a widened roadway. So we're designating land like that already. But how much
improvement right
code
away.
change would it take to be able to set aside spaces for car charging capability later? Would it be a lot of work?
So I think what you're describing, so what happens in the public right-of-way is that we have like an ultimate right-of-way, right? So
Yep.
it should be, make up a number, 50 feet wide, and we can only require so much of that to be improved, and at some point that other lane will be developed. And so if what you're asking is about on street, like on private property, it would look like, I don't think that it would comply with the rules because we would end up requiring some set aside track or something. And we'd
Yeah.
have to say, why we're requiring them to set it aside.
Well, we're requiring space for trees and green spaces. We already don't allow them to put a parking spot everywhere, even if they wanted to. We already say, okay, you got room for 50, but you're only gonna get 40 because you need to have a certain number of trees and bushes and bioswales. So we couldn't squeeze that in there, kind of with the same theory of, okay, we're not, you've got room for a certain amount, but we can set aside some land for car charging, because once it's not set aside, there's no way to add it later.
Well, so that may get into a little bit of what's coming up. I don't think it's on, oh, it is on this slide actually, is that we
Okay.
did ask the public in our outreach if they supported requiring more than the minimum conduit at least. So as part of CFEC, we're already required to require certain developments to have 40% of their parking spaces served with conduit for the charging, not necessarily the charging station.
Yes, if there's parking spaces, but if we have, and nobody's asked to build a development without parking whatsoever. But I'm just saying, if somebody was to do that, then 40% of spaces with conduit for infrastructure, 40% of zero is zero. So that development would never be able to, anyone with an electric car would have to charge somewhere else and pay a bunch of money, so.
Oh, okay, so I think that's on the next slide that's coming up.
Okay.
I'm not sure if, I think we already got the answer to that. I
Okay.
think the answer was already, where there's no minimum requirement, or where we cannot require a minimum,
Right,
we can't require a minimum number of charging spaces.
no. Yeah, I'm just trying to find a backdoor into having spaces available for chargers later, but that requires reserving land.
So maybe a way to think about that then is instead of kind of as a punitive or requiring it, but maybe there's like a carrot approach, like
Yeah.
if the city were interested in offering like higher density in exchange for
Yeah,
providing car charging or something like
Yeah.
that, something that where the developer may decide to reserve spaces for charging based on some incentive.
yeah. An incentive would be good, so, yeah. That sounds good.
We
How
can,
do we put that together?
well, we can think about some ideas, because I'm not sure that, I just threw out density, but that's not always the most favorite one, especially when we're already talking about the corridor, the area that we are. So we can take that back and kind of think through some ideas of what might be a development incentive and bring that back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's it. We did have a little bit of back and forth, and kind of any way that you word like any way that you word the preservation of the space there it's going to be hard to, I wouldn't want to have to argue that that's not a parking space, if it's clearly the intent of it. That said, yeah, it doesn't seem like there's anything that would preclude you from incentivizing that somehow. I'm not exactly sure what form that would take, whether that would be, that would be something interesting, maybe different, different system development charges or whatever, reduction on that if you're providing EV charging or whatever, but certainly possibility there.
I'd like to make a statement.
Yeah, Commissioner?
While we're on this particular OAR, I'd like to have the planning commissioners recommend, as stated in here, not including the fee in lieu of as an option, and pass our opinion on to the city commission, since it was included in the recommendations here.
Right, yeah, that's consistent with recommendations, and I'd support that.
Good. Yeah, so the background there, which you probably remember from last time, you have to do one of three things for new parking, either landscaping with a 40% tree canopy or provision of solar power that specifies how much you need is based on the size of the parking lot. And the third option is, okay, developers can opt not to do any of that and then pay a fee that would be set by you into a fund. And that's where the city starts to really lose interest in this. That fund would be a state fund that you would not have control of. There's no guarantee that money would come back to Oregon City. So based on that, pretty overwhelming public opinion for the tree and or solar. And of that, people seem to prefer the tree canopy requirements. You already have pretty robust tree canopy requirements. The only thing that's really missing to come into compliance with CFEC is that 40% specification. So our recommendation is just keep your tree canopy requirements mostly as they are. Add the requirement that there must be a canopy of covering 40% of the lot at the maturity of the trees. And call it a day there, but there is that interest in solar. There's more interest in landscaping. So in consult with the city, what we decided to do there is basically frame it as a tree canopy requirement, but then put the burden on a particular applicant that if, because of site constraints or any other infeasibility sorts of considerations, you're not able to meet that tree canopy requirement as it's written, the solar option is something that you could then pursue instead.
Can we follow what the NRC has recommended in terms of a tree canopy more recently on terms of what they're recommending on their list? Because they've made more recommendations recently on their advisory on that list, since we're looking at, obviously making better recommendations. Recently, they've made a list of trees that they're recommending for the city and have that part of the site concept.
So the Natural Resources Committee for a long time discussed reforms to the tree regulations citywide, and they presented that idea to the city commission fairly recently in advance of the budget setting sessions, and there wasn't any support to make any changes to the city's existing tree regulations. However, the NRC also heard from Brian and myself to talk about these regulations, and we're generally supportive of the CFEC regulation, which is calling for more tree canopy within parking lots. Up to 40%, I believe, is the minimum for a parking lot over a half an acre. And that's kind of the narrow focus of these regulations. They're targeting parking lots, which are typically non-residential construction, as opposed to citywide tree regulations.
I would
which is
just-
very different.
Yeah, I just would hate to see a bunch of pin oaks and maples. I want to see some diversity. I want to see more native trees. If we're really going to go there and we're really looking at this seriously and we're adopting this, I want to see some native trees in this concept. You know what I mean?
Within the landscaping standards for parking lots. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, that's a good suggestion.
So there is the implementation guidance for that. I think this is what Wilsonville already has a list. I think this is what Cornelius is doing and a few other cities that I'm familiar with that I haven't worked with. Tualatin may be doing it as well. You could have a list of trees that are on your approved list, and they just choose from that. So I thought you guys had a list already, didn't you?
We have, for street trees, we have an approved list.
For
yeah.
street trees.
So we could pull from that, and the NRC developed that list.
Okay. Well, that may be a way to kind of get to that concern and maybe just take your street tree list and have that be your approved list for parking lot landscaping or.
I've just, the street trees that we've seen, I just want to see something a little bit more diversified, more sustainable, something that's actually going to impact the environment in a more positive way. So, and I would even like to see that we try, the mayor's mentioned before, she wants to see more white oaks, like, and obviously that can't be everywhere, but if we can possibly implement that as much as possible, I would love that too. So just as much as possible, because long-term, obviously, in my lifetime, I'm not going to see those get very big, but ideally, long-term for our kids and our kids thereon after, you know, their kids, I'd like to see that for them. So anyways, thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's, yeah, that's, and this is where I wish I knew sort of more about trees and what, you know, the canopy versus size and, you know, the irrigation requirements and that sort of thing. But we'll certainly kind of revisit that, see what folks are doing, because this is, you know, there's been a common concern around the state too, that people wanted, tree preservation is a big thing. So yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, perfect. So EVs, kind of talked a little bit about this with regard to the previous point about, you know, can we require EV charging without parking? There is a EV requirement that you can't require parking. You can say, okay, if you do build parking, the state requires you to, the state requires you to require, I wish I probably need to find some synonyms here, but the state requires you to require at least 40% of new parking spaces to be built, or I'm sorry, 40% of new parking spaces that are built be EV ready when they are at more than 5 units of residential development, mixed use or multifamily of more than 5 units. Excuse me for the word salad there, but I want to point out that that is all, so in the exempt area where you can't require parking, you still have that requirement. If they do build parking, 40% has to be EV. Outside of the exempt area where you do require parking, now you just have that additional requirement of 40% of parking spaces being EV ready. A big piece of the discussion during the outreach phase is that 40% a good number? Do we want to, because obviously a lot of interest on this commission and elsewhere in Oregon City to incentivize the conversion of conventional vehicles to EVs, but and there is some disagreement here, but I feel like the preponderance of feedback we received was sort of, you know, if we're taking away these regulatory requirements, ideally as a way to reduce, you know, cost burdens or whatever, reduce administrative burdens of development, we want to hold to the spirit of that and have this EV requirement be the least that we are required to do. So our code recommendation at this point has that requirement for 40% of the parking in these situations to be EV. And we also heard quite clearly that we want to make sure that the charging infrastructure is not degrading the pedestrian environment. In particular, people were concerned about the idea that a charger may be placed such that you would have to run a cable over a sidewalk or over a pedestrian path through a parking lot to charge your vehicle. And so we're going to make sure that the code is written in a way that precludes that possibility. Next slide, please.
Question, Brian, for you.
Please.
Anywhere in this, is there a definition for EV ready?
So yeah, there were a few definitions that we were saying that we needed, and is that one that, well, has made its way into the conceptual report? I know we did, level 2 charging?
I guess my question would be, if I was a developer, you know, EV ready to me means conduits in the ground, potentially, but is that true, right? Could a development like their electrical service be sized to handle that EV load down the road and not have to put conduits in the ground?
The way that requirement is worded in the OARs is, is conduit in the ground, basically, capable of supporting the level 2 charging station. So Yeah, so we did address that in the definitions. I forget exactly what we did, but again, it's in the report in your packet. And if, by all means, if there's anything there that's not defined clearly or that needs to be defined and is not, let us know and we'll add that definition in. But we do have a definition for level 2 EV charging station. And there was one other EV definition that we're recommending get added. Is that?
I don't remember, but there is a ORS that talks about the provision of electric service capacity for charging electric vehicles. And so that is ORS 455.417. And it talks about, let's see, provisions for electrical service capacity means building electrical service sized for the anticipated load of electric vehicle charging stations that has overcurrent devices necessary for electric vehicle charging stations or has adequate space to add the overcurrent devices. Designated space within a building to add electrical service with capacity for electric vehicle charging stations, or a designated location on building property or in or adjacent to a landscaped area for installing remote service for electric vehicle charging stations, and a conduit system installed from building electrical service. And then it keeps going, or from the dedicated spaces or locations described in subparagraph A to parking spaces that can support at minimum electrical wiring for installation of level 2 electric vehicles charging stations. And if the conduit is for future installation of electric vehicle charging stations, that labels both ends of the conduit to mark the conduit as provided for future electric vehicle charging stations. So
Thank you. That answered it.
I think that got, in my
You can't
words,
just stub
that's
up at the right outside your
panel,
electrical
the
room.
conduit, yeah,
Yeah, they want it to the parking space.
yeah,
Yeah, makes sense, thank you.
and from the source.
Yeah, no, they covered it.
Yeah.
It didn't define level 2.
Yeah, I'd have to keep
How many
looking for
amps?
that.
We actually, yeah, so
16.
what Aquila just cited
How many?
was, that's a recommendation for your code that's cribbed directly from their implementation guidance for the definition of electric service capacity. Yeah, so we caught this and added a definition, recommending adding a definition to OCMC that says level 2 electric vehicle charging station means an electric vehicle charging station that uses 240 volt AC electricity for charging an EV, which
I heard
I just
volts.
kind of wrote that. I think that
I-
covers it, but if,
I didn't hear amps.
is there an amperage requirement?
It's like, I was wrong, it's
It can be
20.
30 to 70.
It can be, 20 is the lowest you can
Yeah.
get, which is functionally 16 with the D rate, but,
Which is like 10 gauge wire, wouldn't,
12 gauge wire.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's dumb.
Yeah, well, you
Yeah.
know,
We should put in, I mean, can we require 6 gauge? Can we require 50
that's
amps?
50 amps.
Because that is pretty much every charger on the market that you can buy now.
I mean, you'd
I
have
think
to
if we
put
don't
in,
define it, they're gonna exploit the lowest
well,
allowable gauge.
yeah, but if you're gonna have, I mean, how many 6 gauge runs are you gonna have in one piece of conduit?
Well, just one.
Just one.
But
It's not that much.
the infrastructure needs to be able to
Yeah.
support 50 amps per charger. So I think we need to define the amps.
I'm wondering, though, I guess I'd like to check in with the building division, because I'm wondering if we should actually have requirements for electrical capacity
Yeah.
in the land use code versus, when somebody comes in, they're going to have to show the building department how this is supported, and I'm not,
Level 2 doesn't define the current. It just defines the type of charger, not the load on the system. So we need to define the load on the system.
Well,
but does that belong in the land use code? And that's,
We have to put it somewhere.
if you're gonna, yeah, if you're gonna define, if you're gonna have level 2 in the
Yeah.
land use code, then level 2 needs to be defined.
Yeah.
But the level 2 definition of 240 volt, I mean, the lowest you can get is a 16 amp charger on a 20 amp circuit for 240.
And that's the wire they're gonna put in there because they're cheap.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, they're not gonna put the wire in, they're just gonna put in the minimum size conduit and put in a 1/2 inch conduit for,
But the panel that it goes to and then the meter base is gonna have to be sized, appropriately. So, I mean, it might be putting in 150 amp panels where if we say we gotta have 50 amps per charging station, then we have to put in a 200 amp. And once you put in the 150s, it's gonna be super expensive to upgrade.
yeah,
Because then everything's too small.
right.
So we need to address it now.
Okay, well, I would like to talk to the building division. They
Okay.
already have a requirement through the Oregon specialty codes where they are, builders are supposed to already be putting in 20% of the parking stalls are supposed to have conduit in there.
Okay.
I don't know how much of that we've actually seen. I understand that you want to have level 2 defined. I would rather not do that here and speak to just some folks who are going to have to review it as to what that may mean.
You had a good point there. If they're going off of Oregon specialty electrical code, if level 2 is defined in there, then we're covered. So it's going to have to align with our electrical code. It'd be good to know what the definition of level 2 in our electrical specialty code is.
And yes, that's what I would like to
Okay.
do. make
Can
sure
we
they
discuss
align.
that at the next meeting?
Yeah.
Can we figure that out? Okay.
Yeah. we can
I'm happy with that.
figure it
Thank you.
Okay, hold on, I'm just making a note. You can advance to, no, we're on the right slide already, thank you. Yeah, so I think this is the last one here, certainly the last number. Yeah, 630, provide bicycle parking and small-scale mobility device parking in climate-friendly areas and at key destinations. Those, I forgot the out quote there, but key destinations are a thing that is defined in the new OAR, and things like schools, libraries, grocery stores, places that, either you probably go on a daily basis, or if you were living as you quote unquote should, you would be going on a daily basis, libraries. Generally, public feedback was supportive of this. A lot of folks that ride bikes or whatever were participating, wanted to make sure that we're including space for things like family bikes, cargo bikes, those sorts of things, as opposed to just the little ones that could go on hooks. Not every bike can do that, so we want to make sure the code contemplates that. By and large, your bike parking requirement is fairly robust, and largely it's already in compliance. There are a couple minor language tweaks that we think are needed just for clarity. I don't want to say the bulk of these requirements, but at least the on-street piece and the element about providing parking at key destinations and in climate-friendly areas, this is another thing that is going to be part of your next TSP update. And that's where you'll just sort of show, bike corrals, those sort of thing in some areas downtown near those key destinations and that sort of thing. From a development code standpoint for this exercise, fairly minor tweaks, but you're already pretty much in compliance with what you're requiring for bike parking from development. Next slide, please. Oh, I did forget one, maximums. So cities over 25,000 in the metro area, you're required to enact parking maximums. By and large, you already have parking maximums that comply with the Oregon administrative rule, which I think is based mostly on Metro's rules that I can't even keep track of this based on that. But at the end of the day, Oregon City is in compliance citywide with the maximums that you are required to implement only in the half-mile buffer around transit and your downtown, except for some multifamily uses, you're a little bit higher than the requirement that the state wants on that. So you have to scale down your maximum requirement a little bit for studio apartments and studio and non-studio, excuse me. You do have to scale back your maximum requirement for those unit types. We asked throughout the process whether that maximum should just be in place within that half-mile buffer, or whether that should just be one consistent maximum citywide, since it's such a minor code tweak. And the preponderance of feedback we received is just, let's have one consistent maximum citywide, so that's what we're recommending at this juncture. Next slide, please. So basically, trying to put the conceptual approach to compliance all on one slide. We have the map, you've seen that map before, that includes the half-mile buffer around line 33, as well as a half-mile buffer around the Metro Regional Center that is downtown Oregon City. We're going to eliminate requirements within that buffer. Outside of that buffer, there is a requirement to implement options to reduce the burden of parking mandates, eliminate mandates for certain uses that are high priority equity uses, implement a number of management approaches and alternatives to mandates. This is one reason that this option is attractive to Oregon City. A few of the key requirements within that section, within 445, namely the requirement to meter some of your on-street parking, you already meet. So some of that is a relatively light lift to get into compliance. At the same time, in addition to that reform, the landscape and design requirements that we talked about, the additions to bike parking requirements that we talked about, the language to require 40% of EV spaces or 40% of parking spaces be EV ready in 5 or more unit residential developments. And lastly, the reduction of maximums for multifamily housing. So easy peasy, set of code. You recommend it to City Commission, they adopt it, and you get to stay Oregon City. You don't have to change your name to Idaho City or California City, as we were worried about at our last meeting. So I think that's it before we advance to the question slide. Yeah. Anything else here? Yeah, before we formalize it into code, please.
I found the definition. So if we could say, as defined in OAR 918-460-0200, level 2, supplied by not less than 40 amps at 208-240.
Would you give me that citation again? I'm sorry.
The citation of the administrative rule?
Yeah.
918-460-0200.
Thank you.
Look.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'll refer to that. Get something in there, a little bit more specificity.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
How does retroactivity come into play with this when I know that it applies to all newly constructed parking lots, but what about existing parking lots that may be rebuilt, repaved, or restriped? How does that come into effect?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are a number of requirements within, and we didn't talk too much about them because they're fairly prescriptive, but option 3, I forget exactly which section it is. It might be 435 or 445, but that has some additional requirements there for what you can and can't require as part of the redevelopment of a parking lot. Additionally, certain land uses, if you're redeveloped if you have a development that gets redeveloped into a land use that doesn't have parking requirements under the new administrative rules, you would not be required to, or you could redevelop the parking lot away from that, or develop it into something outside of parking. But yeah, so, and you asked specifically about retroactivity. I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but when a development, a development that comes in under the new code, of course, is going to be subject to the new requirements And someone that sees this coming, that's maybe thinking of a development or whatever, could simply wait to develop under the new code, if that's what you're wondering regarding that. But yeah, the redevelopments, it kind of depends a good bit on the current use and the proposed use and a number of other factors there. That's all detailed in the conceptual report. And I'm trying to look specifically at for the redevelopment considerations. Yeah, so, OAR 660-012-445, those are parking management alternative approaches. That's where you'll find some of the redevelopment requirements, or the things that that you're prohibited from requiring as part of redevelopment. So part of that, no parking mandates for change of use of or redevelopment of buildings vacant for more than 2 years. So is vacant for more than 2 years, you can't require parking. They have to be able to document that it has been in fact vacant for 2 years. No requirements to provide additional parking for a change of use or redevelopment where at least 50% of the building floor area is retained. You can't require parking if it's an expansion of an existing business by less than 30% of its existing footprint. And yeah, I think that's it for redevelopment specifically. Is that what you're asking?
I wasn't thinking necessarily of a redevelopment or a change of use. I was thinking more of, let's say, for example, a business has 50 parking spaces, and the parking lot is 35 years old, so they need to tear out all the existing asphalt and rebuild the entire parking lot, same use, same owners, everything is the same. Would they be required to comply with all these new regulations?
That's probably one for your city staff. My take on that is no, if they're retaining their use and they're just redoing an existing parking area, is that?
Sure.
Boy, I got him on that one. Good for me.
We have to take a look at our non-conforming. Oh, it's new. No strings. Okay. We have to take a look at our pre-existing non-conforming structures code and make some provision in there. I think we need to define what the threshold is. Yeah, I mean, how much repaving is gonna, and what's that gonna cost? Under the current code, I think we have a threshold of $75,000 for exterior site improvements, and that's in the non-conforming structure part of the code, which is a pretty high threshold to meet for requiring a parking upgrade, but this might be more prescriptive, judging by the OAR. So I'd like to get some specific feedback from Evan Manville about that at DLCD.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Pete. I think it may be situation specific. So what you're describing, if we were to take like the Safeway, for example, and nothing has changed about it, they just need to maintain their parking lot. What I'm wondering, and I guess what we'd want to ask DLCD is if we have to change maximum parking and their redevelopment, they currently are over whatever the maximum number is, and when they redo it, they'll still be over the maximum number. Does that fall under non-conforming? So I think that is a question that we'll have to get some clarity on. To me, that's the situation that I'm picking out. Like, I think what Brian was describing, if there's a change in use, if there's a change in square footage, that would trigger a look anyway. So if there's nothing else, it's just redeveloping the parking lot. I'm wondering about that parking maximum.
If you're just replacing the surface of the parking lot, I mean, that doesn't trigger any permits, right? That they can just do that. So how would the city know to,
It does trigger permits.
just to repave a parking lot?
Yeah, we have a type 1 review for repaving parking lot with no change in striping. It's a clear and objective requirement.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay. So if the boundaries of the parking lot don't change, I don't see why there would be, I can't imagine why we would want to, if the curbs and the planters and such are the same and they're just resurfacing, there's no reason to add extra infrastructure cost, I wouldn't think, but that's just my opinion.
Right, and I think it's just a question to clarify. So the only situation where I could see that, I guess that I would want to get clarity on is that maximum parking situation. And there are times where if it really is bad, right, they've got to grade it and they really have to get in there. They're not just like kind of slurry seal patching it up.
I'd hate to put a business in the position where they can't fix their deteriorating parking lot for fear of losing parking spaces. That seems counterproductive to the community and the business owner in general.
I'm not in disagreement with that.
Yeah. The common trigger that I've seen in other jurisdictions is the grading, right? If you're changing elevation or you're changing the parking count, then that's a trigger. But otherwise, it's a maintenance project.
Typically, yeah.
For what it's worth.
Yeah, I would be more, yeah, I don't think a situation would arise just because we're only changing multifamily. The only maximums we're changing are multifamily. So there wouldn't be a situation where a redevelopment would require a reduction in the parking count unless it's something really old that went in before your current code. I don't know how old those maximums are. But yeah, it's an interesting thing because I think Oregon City is a little bit unusual there in that the requirement, yeah, there would be a land use process even if you wanted to just repave an existing parking lot, right? Which typically if it didn't trigger a land use process, there'd be no reason to even look at it. But we'll circle back to DLCD for clarity on that and what exactly the trigger is that would require something non-conforming to be brought up into conformance. It's a good question.
And a branch off that is, obviously, we have a lot of churches in Oregon City, right? And we look at, parking lots, and a lot of parking lots open during the week. We have a lot of churches, in historic Oregon City, on top of, grocery stores and empty lots. We have Joann's, who knows what's going to happen there long-term. But we also, I've been hearing a talk of possibly a mega church being built, possibly Mountain View, long-term. I don't know if that's within city limits or, okay, no. Okay, but if there was such a thing, because obviously freedom of religion too, how, I don't know how, obviously it would apply to these new rules to a degree, isn't that right?
So you're asking if church use would?
Yeah, most likely a mega church wouldn't have the room to be built in the city limits at this point, because the mega churches, one's at Clackamas Community College, one's at Eastham. Most likely, if there was any type of large parking lot, it would be repaved, not at an existing parking lot, you would think.
But so if there's something new coming in.
Right, exactly. What would be the circumstance under that?
Well, so as Brian just mentioned, the maximums only apply to multifamily. So what we would be looking at are the, I think probably just that tree canopy cover. So I'm assuming that we're talking about a parking lot that's half acre or greater.
Okay.
So some of those design aspects would be the things that apply to those.
And then the other thing is, when we're looking at, there was mentioning of ADU and electrical and other things, are we going to be a little bit, obviously, more creative in terms of, we're looking at possibly being able to set an ADU, and we've talked before about, SDC fees and other things. Are we looking that long-term about trying to be a little bit more flexible towards that if we're looking at being able to possibly set an ADU on an empty spot to have, we're looking at affordability? Are we going to be entertaining that long-term possibly if we're going to have an empty lot and obviously room to have, possibly access to be able to set an ADU, or what are we looking at long-term?
So you're asking if an accessory dwelling unit can be placed on a parking stall?
If we're looking at that long-term, what are the goals in terms of looking at affordability long-term? If we're looking at long-term goal of trying to create more affordability in terms of housing, this would be the goal, obviously, to be able to utilize land more for more affordable housing. So are we looking at long-term as well as looking at SDC fees and concerning empty lots if we're looking at setting possible housing or affordable housing?
The short answer is no. There's no discussion about SDCs. Well, I take that back. There are discussions about SDCs, specifically parks right now. Other infrastructure SDCs are not being considered, like the methodology isn't changing at this time. I think South Fork Water Board is looking potentially at their SDCs, and then I think there's one other one that's already tiered based on square footage size. But that, I think, is a completely different project than this. Although the climate-friendly, equitable communities purpose is to reduce the cost because parking cost, there's a cost associated with it. It costs to build it, it costs to maintain it. So I think the philosophy behind this is that if there is less parking required, then the costs will go down. I'm not making any statements about that, but I think that's part of the thought process. I don't think that there's any discussion in any of this about accessory dwelling units, so that would end up being a totally different discussion.
Thank you.
My recollection, the last time the proportional SDCs were brought up, the city manager had an overwhelmingly negative and immediately negative reaction to the idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add on to that a little bit, so the idea with tiering the SDCs is that, smaller square footage has a lower price, but that then means that it has to offset because it still costs to provide the infrastructure. So then the higher square footage pays a higher price. So it has to zero out, if you will. It's not really the right way to say it, but.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Commissioner, a quick comment on the non-conforming. It may be something everybody already knows, but I'm going to state it anyway. In Oregon, when dealing with non-conforming uses and structures, repairs and alterations are generally permitted as long as they comply with current building codes and don't expand the non-conformity. One of the things to mention about that is it needs to have been legal when it was originally built. So if it didn't comply with the code, like from 1970, when they built that was like an illegal parking lot. That wasn't a non-conforming to today's standards. They just didn't build it legally. So you can repair it, the way I read that, you can repair it if it was legal when they built it. If it wasn't legal when they built it and you asked to repair something that shouldn't be there and never was, then you'd probably have to redesign it. That's how I see it. That sound right?
That's generally how we apply
Okay.
non-conforming, legal non-conforming, yeah.
And sometimes you get into, was it even regulated? So did that mean it was permitted?
Yeah.
Okay, so is that it? Yeah.
Okay, so just to kind of recap a little bit, so we'll go back and think about some potential incentives to incentivize more EV charging spaces. We are going to pass on the recommendation not to include the fee in lieu as one of the climate mitigations. And then we can look at listing the types of trees that go into the parking lot coverage. There's consensus on that to look at, or maybe maybe the wording is to prioritize native
Yeah.
species.
I mean, I would also add on to that and to have the right tree, right place philosophy, and like, because you're not gonna be able to put an Oregon white oak in the middle of a parking island, you're gonna have to use something else. That's just common sense stuff. So there's a lot of lit out there about, not only using native trees, but also the right native trees in the right location. So
Okay.
that's all.
Okay, and then, thank you, Commissioner Schlagenhofer, we defined level 2. So we don't, we will work that in, but we don't necessarily have to go back and research that, so. Yeah, I think that's it.
All right, so, so the next steps, I guess, you are going to be presenting this to the City Commission at their work session on March 11th, which is tomorrow.
Correct.
And then we have our first public hearing for April 14th, 2025.
Correct. Yep.
And that's pretty much it. We can,
Yeah, those are
Yeah.
the next steps, and we will meet our requirement to have it implemented by June, end of June, so.
tremendous. It'll be interesting to see, how that will all shake out as far as not requiring parking for any of those areas that are identified in that buffer.
Yes, correct.
All right, so let's go to the next agenda item. And communications.
Yes, so usually at communications, I'm telling you about what we've got coming up next. And I don't have anything on the agenda for March 24th. So that lines up with your spring break. So
Okay.
here you go, spring break.
Nice.
And then on April 14th, though, we do have kind of a full agenda. We will have a work session, and that's where we'll bring you an update on Thimble Creek. So I think at our last meeting, you had asked for an update on the work that's the industrial site readiness project that's going on out there. So Christina Robinson Gardner and Ann Griffin from Economic Development will bring you an update. And then you will hear a master plan for Clackamas Community College and a public hearing on CFEC. So,
That's all on April 11th,
14th.
or 14th, rather?
Yes.
We're going to have a 6 o'clock work session then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Very good. And I would adjourn the meeting, but I don't have my gavel, so we're just not going to be able to do it.
There you go.
Meeting adjourned.
All right.
Sorry.